Someone in the comments section asked me if I would do a video about my teacher Nishijima Roshi, so I'm glad to oblige. One of the first things I did in order to prepare for this video is I made a playlist for you that are videos you can find on YouTube, either featuring Nishijima Roshi speaking or about Nishijima Roshi. So I'll put a link below in the description section of this video to that, and you can watch those yourself. If you want kind of a generic biography of Nishijima Roshi, the one that's on Wikipedia is pretty good, so I'm not gonna go into his personal history and stuff. What I'd like to do instead is talk about a specific thing that just came out, which is that Michael Lutchford, who is one of Nishijima Roshi's Dharma heirs, a British guy, put out a website called shobogenzo.net. And on shobogenzo.net, just about a week ago, he put up this PDF file called Handbook of Authentic Buddhism. And Handbook of Authentic Buddhism is something that he received from Nishijima Roshi in 1998, with the intention that he would edit it and then put this out as a little Handbook of Authentic Buddhism by Nishijima Roshi. For reasons that are explained by Mr. Lutchford himself on his page on shobogenzo.net, that never happened. But now, 21 years later, or 22 years later, depending on how you figure it, that book is finally out and it's available on a PDF, and I really like it. The reason I like it so much is it is a very nice, concise, quick read. I think it's 75 pages long, that kind of lays out all of Nishijima Roshi's greatest hits. Like, if you want to know what Nishijima Roshi talked about in his lectures, the ones that I attended in the 1990s, this is pretty much all of his big topics. So I'm going to go through those a little bit with you and give you some quotes and then turn you loose to go look at the thing yourself, which I encourage you to do. He starts off with the precepts, which I think is very telling, because Dogen, who is, of course, Nishijima's big, he's part of the Dogen fan club there. Dogen said that the most important teaching in Buddhism is shoaku makusa, which means don't enact wrong, and I wrote a book about that called Don't Be a Jerk, because I took shoaku makusa and changed it to Don't Be a Jerk as kind of idiomatic American English. So I think it's significant that he starts off with the precepts and an explanation of the precepts and where they come from and what they are. Next up, he talks about the object of worship. And I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because this is something he said often. He would say that the object of worship in Buddhism is reality itself. So instead of having the object of worship be Buddha or God or Jesus or Muhammad or whoever else you might put in there, Krishna, Vishnu, whoever, the object of worship in Buddhism is reality. But what is reality? Well, I'd like to read you a couple of quotes from the book that might help explain what that means. First, he says, Master Dogen describes reality as fukaku fuchi. Fu means denial, kaku means perception, and chi means recognition. Therefore, fukaku fuchi means beyond perception and beyond recognition, and this is also a description of reality. So reality is not what we perceive with our senses, nor is it what we recognize with our minds. It is something that is beyond both of those, and this is a very important part of Nishijima Roshi's philosophy. He also says, some people think that reality might belong to the area of sense perception, but in Buddhism we do not think that what is perceived is reality. What is perceived is just what is perceived. People who are called materialists usually make this mistake. They think that what they perceive is reality. Therefore, they sometimes call themselves realists. But this idea might be wrong. This idea comes from their own overestimation of themselves. Generally speaking, what is perceived is always individual and limited to what is perceived. But reality has to be totally inclusive like the universe. So we should never identify what we perceive with reality. I really like that, and that was something that struck me hard, because when I first started studying with Nishijima Roshi, I was getting the impression that he believed, or that Buddhists in general believed, that reality is reality as defined by the materialists. And our overall society tends to identify reality or realism with materialism very strongly. But Buddhism doesn't take that standpoint. It acknowledges materialism as a useful way of looking at reality when you're limiting it to the area of matter. But it doesn't say that matter is the whole of reality, and that's really important to understand. And Nishijima Roshi was pounded that in a lot in his talks. Next up comes probably the most difficult part that I have when it comes to my trying to explain Nishijima Roshi's philosophy, which is his rejection of the standard idea of the Four Noble Truths and his substitution, as it were, instead of what he called the Four Philosophies. Now, the Four Noble Truths, as anybody who's done a introductory course on world religions knows, are all life is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire, the way to end suffering is to cut off desire, and the way to cut off desire is to follow the Eightfold Noble Path of Buddhist ethical conduct. Nishijima Roshi didn't like the idea that all life is suffering because he could see that there was plenty of things in life that were not suffering, nor did he like the idea that you should try to cut off desire because it's impossible to cut off desire. So he had this problem where he felt like Buddhism was valuable and made a lot of sense, but he couldn't accept this basic philosophical premise that's always presented at the very beginning of any course of study in Buddhism as, here's what Buddhism is all about. So if you can't accept this basic foundational stuff, then how can you accept the rest of it? Well, through his study, he discovered that Dogen had this tendency to phrase things in terms of four philosophical points of view, which Nishijima Roshi identified as subjective, objective, action, and reality. And Nishijima Roshi believed that the Four Noble Truths had been misunderstood since the very beginning of Buddhism, and what was really being expressed by the Buddha and never really got conveyed to his students was this idea of four philosophies. Now, I will let you read the book yourself to see whether you think you can make that leap. Also, I have tried to explain this in depth in several of my books. I know it's in Hardcore Zen, and I don't know, it's probably in a lot. It's probably in every book I've written that I've done at least a little riff on this. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I think it's a very interesting way of looking at things because really I have to agree with Nishijima Roshi. My entire life is not suffering, and trying to cut off desire does seem to me to be an impossible thing. So I have to think that he's right, that maybe the early Buddhists got it wrong when they tried to understand what Buddha was telling them, and it became kind of confused, and then people like Dogen and others came along and put it right later on. If you don't buy it, that's fine, but that's what Nishijima Roshi always said about that. Next up, Nishijima Roshi talks about the physical side of Buddhism. And in this regard, he was very, very influenced by the works of an American psychologist named Carl Menninger. And Carl Menninger's books that Nishijima loved to talk about were Man Against Himself, Love Against Hate, and I believe there was one other one. I think they're all listed in the book. I read Love Against Hate and Man Against Himself a long time ago, but he really believed in this idea of the balance of love and hate, which I've talked about a lot, because when I first started studying Buddhism, I thought it was all about learning to love and forgetting how to hate, as Ozzy Osbourne said in Crazy Train, I believe. But Nishijima Roshi would talk about the balance of love and hate. And what he meant by hate is not exactly what most people mean when they say hate, like hate speech or, this kind of stuff, racial hatred and all that. He meant a much more primal sort of thing, a kind of aversion and attraction maybe would be a way to put it, another way. But he believed that these had to be balanced, a balance between that which you are attracted to and that which you are which you hate, which you are not attracted to, and finding a balance between those. And he talks about that in that section of the book. Then he goes on to one of his favorite topics, which is the autonomic nervous system. And I can't tell you how many times I sat in a room in Tokyo listening to Nishijima Roshi go on and on about the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system and the need to balance them. When I heard this, and I heard his description of Zazen as the balance of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems in the autonomic nervous system, I found it very reductionist. And this is a word I don't often use because I'm not good with the big words. And I didn't even know that what was annoying about it was the fact that I found it reductionist. But reductionist, as I understand it, is this idea of reducing everything to just physical effects. And I thought, oh my God, there's so much more to Buddhism than just the physical aspects of it. But what Nishijima Roshi was indicating is that if there is a spiritual reality, and he was sort of reluctant to use this word spiritual reality or word phrases like that, but I think he did believe in it. If there is a spiritual reality, then this spiritual reality is mirrored in physical reality as well. So if you can understand the physical reality of what's going on in Zazen, that is a way to get into the spiritual aspects of what's going on in Zazen. And he was very much interested in this idea of the balance of the autonomic nervous system. Now, he wasn't a physician or a neurologist, so he does say this in the book, that he's kind of going off what he's learned from people who are neurologists and doctors and things. But I think this is an interesting way to put it because it gets rid of all the kind of, as Sam Harris likes to say, woo-woo parts of it and says, okay, just think about physical reality, and we know there is a nervous system and it's divided into these parts. Let's talk about that and forget about any sort of woo-woo explanations that we might be more attracted to. Then we get up to another favorite topic of his, which is action. He believed that Buddhism was a philosophy of action. And the way I understood this philosophy of action, this thing he always said, was that Buddhism is not a philosophy that you just think about and you just understand in your head. It's a philosophy that you do. That means that in order to really understand Buddhism, you can't just understand it intellectually, you have to do it, which means you have to practice Zazen. No one can understand Buddhism unless they are doing a Zazen practice, and that was his firm line in the sand there. Now, a lot of people, academics of course, would really argue with that, but I think Nishijima Roshi was right. And the best way I can kind of compare that to is you could know every statistic in the world about baseball, but if you can't play baseball, well, you're not doing baseball unless you're actually playing the game. So as many statistics and history and everything else that you understand, well, that's fun, and maybe you can talk about that with your friends, but you got to really do the game if you're going to understand the game properly. Same with Buddhism. The game of Buddhism is Zazen practice, and not just the intellectual explanations of Zazen practice and the philosophy that surrounds it. Next up, he uses one of his favorite phrases, which is the will to the truth. I like to talk about this in terms of willingness to the truth, because will to the truth has a bit of a, I don't know, for some reason it makes me think of Triumph of the Will, the movie about the Nazis and stuff, the movie that the Nazis made about themselves. And it gets a little uncomfortable. I think will to the truth means a willingness to accept the truth, that you are, and also it does contain this idea of will, as in I am going to put all my effort into understanding the truth rather than understanding some description of the truth. Next up, we get into an area which everybody likes to argue about, which is cause and effect. He always said cause and effect, and I don't think I ever heard him say karma. I mean, he might have used the word every once in a while. I'm sure he did somewhere. But he was very quick to pivot and talk about it in terms of cause and effect. Because cause and effect is something you can see scientifically, and karma tends to get people spinning their wheels about, oh, what happens to crippled children and all this stuff. And I've talked about that in in previous videos that I think it's better not to understand karma in terms of how it affects other people, but how it affects ourselves. That's the way I understand karma. Karma should always be pointed inward and never outward. But here's a couple of quotes about karma. Buddhism teaches us that we are a part of the universe. We are not isolated entities, but elements in a system. A grand system that is reflected in every small part, in every being. All beings in the universe share a quality or essence which cannot be named or described. It is an ineffable something. It is the basis of life itself. So if we are to express our true nature as human beings, it is natural for us to care about that which we have in common with all living beings. It is naturally for us to want to save other living beings. And this, I think, is important because part of the problem that people get into in trying to understand Buddhist ideas about karma is they are stuck with this idea of self. So they think that karma is something that affects a permanent self. So if a permanent self is a mass murderer in one lifetime, then they might be reborn in the next lifetime as a blind child or something, somebody with muscular dystrophy or something. It's always, think about the children, kind of thing. But my take on this is, I don't care how you got into the situation that you're in. So I wouldn't respond to a handicapped child differently if I believed that the handicap was due to some kind of karmic effect of a past life, which I am skeptical of anyway, or not. I'm going to try to treat that handicapped child with kindness because that's on me. That's what I can do about this situation. That's my karma. That's the karma that involves this right here. So I don't think it matters very much whether you believe that people who are, seemingly having random bad things happen to them, whether this is really a result of karma or not. It only matters in terms of how I behave. If I want to behave right, then I'm going to try to do right at this moment, and I'm not going to worry about how another person got into whatever situation that they happen to be in. Here's another quote. Buddhists believe that when our conduct is good, we will become happy, and when our conduct is bad, we will inevitably be unhappy, with the exactness of a scientific fact and with no exceptions. Now again, point this at myself. That's what I do. If you want to point it at other people, I think you're going to get yourself into trouble. I point this at myself. Although many people doubt this principle, in our day-to-day life it is true. I think he's describing his own experiences. When we behave right, our body and mind are balanced. The balanced state is called happiness. Good conduct is always connected with happiness. Bad conduct inevitably brings unhappiness. Again, point it at yourself. That's my advice. When you point it at somebody else, it's going to get all weird and you're going to get speculative and you're not going to understand the situation. But if you look at your own conduct and see how your own conduct makes you feel, that, I think, is extremely useful. Next up, he talks about the instantaneousness of the universe. And this is his way of solving the age-old dilemma of the conflict between freedom of choice and determinism. So if you look at things in terms of linear time, everything seems to be determined. Everything that happened in the past affects what happens now, affects what happens in the future. You can't get out of it. But in terms of the present moment, there is something you can do right now, spontaneously, that is not necessarily determined 100% by your past. That means you do have freedom in this moment, and that's what he expressed as the instantaneousness of the universe. So at this moment, this is the universe. The past and the future are cut off. And we live in the present moment. And everybody loves living in the present moment, don't they? Next up, he talks about Zazen. And when it comes to Zazen, he was a purist. Meaning he trusted Dogen's explanation of how to do Zazen over and above any other version of how to do Zazen. And some of the things he has to say about that are Some sects of Buddhism practice abdominal breathing or counting of the breaths. Some use koans to meditate on the truth. But these methods of Zazen are usually unnecessary and seem to have come from a lack of regular practice of Zazen. Some people will get upset about that. If you have fine wood, a veneer is not necessary. So he was interested in Zazen as a raw process, and we'll get into exactly what he thought that was as we go along. Because next up, he talks about something that I heard him talk about so many times, which is his 4 points of Zazen practice. And that is Hishiryo, which means it is different from thinking. 2, Shoshin Taza, which means sitting up straight and making the body right. 3, Shinjin Datsuraku, which means dropping off body and mind, and he identified this as what happens when the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, are balanced. We drop off body and mind. And the number 4 one is Shikantaza, which means just sitting. And I'll let you read the book to get into what all of those mean, because he spends about a paragraph or maybe a few paragraphs on each one. But this is a major facet of his way of explaining what Zazen is. He didn't like koans or breathing exercises or any of that stuff, counting breath. He thought you sit up straight, make your body right, and do shikantaza, which is just sitting. And along these lines, he says, there is no difference between enlightenment and the state in Zazen. The state in Zazen cannot be separated from the practice itself. This oneness between the aim of the practice and our experience in Zazen is called Shusho-ito, the perfect oneness of practice and experience. Shu means practice and Sho means experience. In action, practice and experience are always one. So Master Dogen described Zazen as shikantaza, or just sitting. He told us to just sit. Without practice there is nothing, and where there is practice, there exists everything. Then he gets into the bit that I think is going to bother people. He talks about history. And he had this very firm belief in that there was a stream of history which he usually identified with what we would call Western history. I found that fascinating because obviously he's Japanese, so he grew up learning a different form of history from what we learn, especially because he was in high school and everything before World War II even happened. So he was learning this Asian sort of version of history centered on Japan. But he believed that the mainstream of world history was the stream that flowed through Greece and into Rome and into Europe in the Middle Ages and went to America and the West. And he believed those were the most important things to look at in terms of history. And I know a lot of people chafe at that. And I know that even I have spoken recently on this video channel that people should be more aware of Asian history if they want to understand Buddhism, because they need to understand the context. So I do think that it is valuable to understand other histories, the histories of Africa and India and Asia and the Inuits and whatever else you want to study. These are all important and significant. But I do think he's right that there is a mainstream of history that everybody is kind of, magnetized towards, and it doesn't necessarily belong to any one race or one nationality. There are certain races and nationalities that have been identified with it, but they didn't invent it. It's a human thing that people gravitate to and see what works, and that's what works. Now, I don't know. I don't want to get into this because it'll just start a lot of beefs in the comments section and stuff, and I don't want to get into that mess. But I think it's interesting the way he gets into that sort of thing. One of the ways he describes this is he says, I think that human beings have arrived at a golden age already where we can practice Zazen every day because of the excellent productivity of developed modern industrial societies. Now, all the lefty types are going to be so angry about that one. It's unnecessary to worry whether it's possible to attain Buddhist truth without becoming a monk or nun. Now, that's part of the previous paragraph where he's talking about how people think that in order to understand Buddhism, you have to go off in a monastery and live there. He didn't buy that. He said, the enormous productivity of the modern age has brought a splendid, privileged age when we can practice Zazen every day and become Buddha in our daily lives. Now, of course, there are lots of places and people in this world who are not experiencing all the splendor and wonder of our golden age. But we have to admit, I think, that even the people in our society who are having the hardest times are probably, even they are having it a lot easier than they would have 100 or 200 years ago, just because there's so much abundance available. So he's not talking about just people who live in the Hollywood Hills in a mansion with a pool and everything. He's talking about our ordinary lives and the access we have to tremendous technology and things that make everything easier. We really don't have to worry about all the things that we had to worry about in the past when we were living more or less like animals. And this has brought about an age where a lot of people can have tremendous freedom, and we can do a practice in a situation that is, protected from a lot of the things that would have prevented people from being able to practice before. Again, not 100% of everybody in the world is experiencing this, but so many more of us are now that it's significant, and we shouldn't ignore that, and I think we can spread this till eventually everybody is living in a much better sort of life. Next up, he talks about power and politics. This is another one that's going to make people mad, but I think it's interesting. He believed that the existence of strong political power, he doesn't say this specifically, but I'll add, backed up by the threat of violence, has made the world a much more peaceful and stable place, and he was of the belief that this was something to be encouraged because it made it possible for other things to happen. Now, of course, he does say that it could become possible for this large world power to go wrong, and we have to protect against that. But for the time being, it's you can say what you want about corruption in the government, but for example, you look at some other places in the world or some places in the past and look at their corruption in government, and it's much, much worse than anything we have today. So there's a gradual bettering of things in this area, and I think he's right in that aspect too, and I'll probably get a lot of people arguing with me about that as well. Finally, he winds up the piece with this wonderful quote that I liked a lot. Even though we are so stupid, so weak, so lacking in self-control, when we practice Zazen, we sit in Dharma at once. This is the great benevolence of Gautama Buddha, and this benevolence has been transmitted from Buddha to Buddha and from Buddhist ancestor to Buddhist ancestor for thousands of years. Relying upon the practice of Zazen, all human beings can be saved. Therefore, we revere Gautama Buddha, we revere the universe, we revere our human life, and we revere reality itself. So there you go. That was a really long video. Some of you were asking me to do longer videos. And I'm just touching on a little bit of each of these things that he says in the book. Just go look at the book and read it for yourself and see what you think of it. I highly recommend it as a way to understand the philosophy of Nishijima Roshi, if that's what you're interested in. Remember that I am supported by your PayPal and Patreon donations, and the links are below as always. Please donate. That really helps me make these videos, and I spent a lot of time on this one this morning. So, it's because of your donations that I'm able to sit and spend a bunch of time trying to put together a video like this. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Bye.